I'll just get into it. And
Here we are, and we are live. We're late. We're 7 minutes late. Ryan Ray is the reason we're late today. My apologies to everyone. And Chris Fenton, Feeding the Dragon Show, Feeding the Dragon Podcast. Mr. Fenton, I do apologize for being tardy today. It's good to be here, though. How are you doing, sir?
I am really good. I've been having a lot of interesting conversations with people way more expert than me about where things are heading and between the two countries and with the Biden administration. And I'm feeling more hopefully optimistic than I ever have, to tell you the truth.
So yes, it's interesting because one of the things we were scrambling to get on here because of my tardiness. So let's one of the things that I've been following to this morning was, I don't know if you saw this or not, that the Biden administration announced on Tuesday. I missed the announcement. I saw some headlines today that tomorrow they're going to have a virtual meeting with the Quad. And so what I found interesting was the press secretary said they were talking about COVID, climate change, and something else. I can't remember what it was, but none of it was China. But then another report, an Asian publication, I believe, come out and said that one of the focal points will be the COVID vaccine in Africa and other spots around the world, because China has been giving out the vaccine to emerging markets all over the world. So I found it interesting that the U.S. press secretary left China strategically out of it when the Quad is a China type anti-stopping pushback, whatever you want to call it, type organization. So any read on that? Because it kind of struck me as weird that first they didn't acknowledge it, but then secondly, other report from other parts of the world is that China will be at least the focal, if not a large portion of the conversation.
Well, look, I mean, there's a lot of news on that front, to tell you the truth. And by the way, with the COVID vaccine and everything too, I find it interesting that Mexico has come out and blatantly said, we're not getting any help from the U.S. It's all coming from China. Mm-hmm. That was interesting. And by the way, not that we need more flare-ups in other parts of the world, but we got a major sort of border issue, it seems, that is flaring up between the U.S. and China. I mean, the U.S. and Mexico. It seems like Mexico is blaming us a bit for the problem. And obviously, we haven't really figured out our immigration policy yet anyway. But then on top of it, to have Mexico come out and sort of brag on behalf of the fact that China is helping them, but where is the United States? That was a little bit of a low blow. But in between all of that, I think, the fact that we have multilateral conversations about China occurring, I'm going to say in a rainbow and unicorn way, that's good, because I don't think we can go it alone. China is a very big challenge that we need both red and blue and green and libertarians and everybody else behind here in this country. But quite frankly, we also need some Western alliance help too, which would be really big for us. And then on top of it, Taiwan's sitting there too, saying, hey, can everybody sort of rally around us? We don't want just one country thinking about it. We want everybody together. But then other things of like little green shoots of good news or potential for good news. It's also the potential for going dovish on China and placating them and pandering and all that other kind of stuff. But at least the idea of some sort of conversation was interesting, right? Like we have the U.S.-China meeting that's going to be happening up in Alaska, which is very different than the one that we had that happened in Hawaii. The weather's a little different up there. But that's interesting. The question is, are we just going to go up there and bend over for them? Or are we actually going to get serious and say, hey, we need to start talking about things that are really ticking us off and ticking off our Western allies? I thought that was interesting. Then on top of it, I'm seeing little bits and pieces of unification and solidarity to tackle this China challenge, right? There was a bipartisan bill that's being discussed by Schumer on Capitol Hill that addresses a lot of the China threat to the United States of America. It's bipartisan. That means both Dems and Republicans are going to be hopefully unifying on a common challenge. How great could that be in so many different ways? I mean, China, the common challenge that unifies the country. I sort of am digging that. I feel like there's a Hollywood movie in that, but not a Hollywood movie that placates to China, one that actually is a good story and placates the rest of the world. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is that AMC, the largest theater chain in the whole United States of America and one of the largest in the world, is now not under the full majority ownership of Wanda anymore. Wanda now only owns 10% of it. They still have 2 board of directors. I'd like to see that get out. But that's sort of good news, I would say. Conflicting that good news, though, is the fact that the Reddit Wall Street bets, craziness of short squeezing allowed Wanda to make a boatload of money selling part of their stake there, which sort of sucks because that actually means the CCP participated in big profits. And of course, American citizens that are involved in that short squeeze at some point are going to get pretty hosed. But anyway, I thought that was really interesting. And one other thing I want to bring up that is a weird sort of silver lining type of good news story is that during the 2 sessions that just is wrapping up in Beijing, they had some of the worst smog ever. And there's nothing better to get a massive centrally planned government behind fighting environmental issues than to have them meet all together in the same cloud of filth. So maybe they start moving towards, now I'm not going to get into oil and natural gas and all that kind of stuff, but cleaner forms of energy. How about that? Maybe they start moving that way.
So yeah, 2 quick notes here. First, we mentioned Dave Snell on the podcast before. I don't know if you happen to see, I put out a newsletter yesterday, and podcast listener Dave Snell was kind enough to give me a quote. He has a unique background, and so folks, reach out. You never know. And so I appreciated his contribution to the newsletter. He obviously had some good and helpful insights. The other thing is on the vaccine, I subscribe to the China Africa Project newsletter, and it is kind of like Bill Bishop, but China Africa angle. So if you're interested in the Africa space, I know Bill Bishop is. I was subscribed to it, and I saw Bill Bishop endorse it. It's a great thing, and of course, Bill Bishop's newsletter. But anyways, so for folks who are interested in what China's doing in Africa or vice versa, how that's working together, the China Africa newsletter is a great spot to kind of follow some of these stories. As if we're being honest here, the U.S. media doesn't do a good job of global coverage as it is. So just want to give those folks a shout out. I think you talking about the track 2 diplomacy that we're seeing in Alaska. It's going to be interesting. I'm a little nervous, Chris, on 2 things. One, we will see what the messaging comes out of the Quad meeting tomorrow. What is said, how strong is the Quad against, I say against, but how resolved are they to stand together to push back on Beijing? We'll find that out. And then 2 is that we haven't talked about the Uyghurs here recently, but the China said to the UN, "Oh, come see what's going on with the Uyghurs." And to my knowledge, we haven't done anything. And so we have to kind of, if we're going to hold their feet to the fire, to use that term, when China opens the door and says, "Come look," in my book, we have to start taking those opportunities to kind of push back and not allow the propaganda to sit out there. Those are easy things to do. We've got useless diplomats sitting in offices doing nothing. Load them up on a plane, go look at the Uyghurs. The fact that we haven't done that is a concern. So I think the next step we'll see before we get to Alaska will be tomorrow. What does the Quad say? And the timing of it is quite interesting.
Yeah, well, a lot of this timing is really interesting. And I think on top of it, you have other sort of factions of both countries getting together and talking, as well as multilateral conversations going on in regards to China. I saw another report that I tweeted out earlier this week that there's a U.S.-China delegation that's getting together to talk about microchips and the choke points on microchips and how to avoid any sort of global shortage or global tension in that space. That's going to be really interesting because I don't know exactly how you address that without kowtowing a bit to China. I hope we hold our own on that conversation. But the good thing is that one green sprouts, the green shoots idea of the greatest thing you can do to avoid a Cold War or war is to continue some sort of people-to-people conversations. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going on. So as long as there's people-to-people conversations going on, I hope that means no missiles are flying through the sky and tensions sort of stay at least normalized. What happens in those conversations, time's going to tell.
Yeah, so let's talk. Excuse me. Sorry. Let's talk about the Olympics. Japan announced that they're not going to allow media in. I think they're going to give all the athletes a vaccine. Obviously, we have the Japanese Olympics come up here in a few months, and then followed by the Beijing Olympics within a year, less than a year from now. Thoughts on that? Because we've talked about China kind of building it up as this big table, this big event. Japan's having to say, well, we'd like to have you, but there's kind of some stipulations. How will China respond to this? Will they kind of use it to kind of make fun of Japan, you think? Will they leave it alone? Because it's been something that's of interest, because China has been very proud of how they've handled the COVID outbreak.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it too much. I mean, one thing about the Japanese Olympics is it does seem there to be a little bit of sympathy around everybody involved with that particular Olympics. I mean, the athletes have been sort of screwed by COVID. COVID is sort of the evil villain, and the protagonists or our heroes are really the athletes and the organizers and all that kind of stuff. Plus, on top of it, Japan's had their hands full with just their Olympic planning committee and the different turmoil and controversies going on there. I think the world overall is probably sort of hoping that Olympics occurs. It's relatively normal. The athletes get to do their thing. The nations get to rejoice in their patriotism when their teams win. And then that will end. And then the focus is going to be Beijing 2020. And I doubt China's going to rock the boat too much, knowing how much pins and needles they're already on in regards to anybody competing in Beijing 2022. So I'd imagine they're going to stay a little quiet on the front.
Okay, one more question for me. I know you had some things that you wanted to get to as well. They just, as you mentioned, they've just concluded the 2 sessions. The GDP projected growth is 6% for 2021. There's been a lot of talk about this. Western commentators are like, wow, this is a sign that there's cracks in the Chinese economy. I think China's coming out and saying, well, listen, our economy's so big now, you can't expect double-digit growth. Both of those things actually could be true at the same time. How do you read these GDP predictions for 2021? Do you think it is reasonable prediction? Obviously, the numbers are juiced, but on some level, do you think it's reasonable, or do you think that, no, this might be a sign that maybe their COVID recovery isn't as fast as they had led us to believe?
You know, my opinion on it, and by the way, no one knows for sure exactly what the numbers are, but as I sort of learned a little bit about how these numbers are processed over there and how they're announced, I realize there's a lot of chinks in the armor in regards to who computes these things and how they eventually come out. A lot of the problem is not normally the CCP or the central, government of China putting out whatever they want to say. What really happens, and it's a little bit symbolic of what happened with COVID, but all these regional, local, municipal governments all have massive amounts of debt on their books in regards to trying to chase the growth projections that they thought would happen by building all kinds of different infrastructure. They need to pay off that debt. They need to service that debt. And a lot of that debt can only be serviced if they have a certain amount of growth. And a lot of that debt and borrowing capacity only exists as long as banks and the lenders actually believe that growth actually is there and is realistic. So a lot of the much smaller entities within China fudge their books. And then as it comes up the food chain, the fudging of those books then affects the bigger books, and then the bigger books, and then the bigger books. And by the time the central government comes out with their actual numbers, who knows how accurate they are? I don't even know if they do. So it's a real issue. And I would say it's just sort of hard to look at it and say, oh, yeah, 6%. That's what we're going to base all of our economics on and how we invest in that country or whatever if you're an outsider. I think all you need to know is that that economy is growing, and it's probably growing faster than any major market on earth by far. And it's going to continue going that way, whether it's 6% or 3% or 4%. It's still a behemoth, and it's only getting larger.
Okay, I know you had a few things to get into. I want to say this. I was on a call this morning with some folks, and a lot of the things that you said to open the show was kind of echoed as far as there's cautious optimism in the air. So hopefully things will stay at least cautiously optimistic for the foreseeable future, because that's better than no optimism at all, which it feels like for a few years now we've been in that boat.
Yeah, I think my optimism is about like a major threat, probably a distant threat, but one that always is lurking, which is like some sort of confrontation with China. I think the people-to-people exchanges is key to making sure that doesn't happen. But the optimism from that doesn't necessarily leak into us addressing the underlying problems that we talk about on this show and that are facing our country and our Western allies. And that's really where the rubber hits the road, or whatever that term is, when we see what happens in these conversations and whether we get any sort of progress towards solving some of these issues. So fingers crossed, cautiously optimistic. As far as some of the things that I'll just roll down and you can tell me what you want to hit, but just looking at a lot of the news that's coming out, I love all the China-Russia gang up when it comes to space. That's interesting to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
The Confucius Institutes, I think that's another one we should hit on. Li Keqiang and made an announcement that China and the WHO are going to continue to investigate the origins of COVID, which I find really crazy. Another rep came out and said, let's not pay back our debt or interest payments to China in order to retaliate for certain things. Hong Kong, obviously a huge subject when it comes to what the two sessions was talking about. And we've seen a lot of that crackdown over the last few days. We already covered the Olympics. We covered Alaska, heavy smog. Oh, and then Europe is finally waking up to TikTok and going, hey, there might be some big data issues here. And I sort of think we should talk a little bit about the big data stuff. So what would you like to hit first?
Let's go to the moon, baby. Let's go to the moon. Like GameStop, we're going to the moon. I read that headline and I thought, am I reading the Onion here? Is this the Babylon Bee? No, it's that they're partnering to go to the moon. And so there's kind of two separate issues. You have the Russia-China partnership, ally, whatever you call it. That in and of itself is a concern for Western allies. If they are getting more buddy-buddy, I don't know if they can ever really truly be true allies, but you have to worry about that. But then the other thing that concerns me is that we get caught up in this narrative of, oh my gosh, Russia and China are going to the moon, and we start trying to compete with them on things that really right now we shouldn't be concerned with. From my perspective, there's a lot of other work that needs to be done. Let them go to the moon and do all the stuff they want to do up there. Focus down here for now. That's kind of my read on it, but it was kind of one of those things like, oh, I never thought I'd see that headline, but now it's there.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting seeing that they're going to the moon together. I thought that was really romantic, actually, in a lot of ways. And I also thought a headline today was that they also announced that they're going to work together to create another space station together. And I tweeted out that I think the bar on that space station is going to have a full stock of vodka and Baijiu. So I would imagine they're going to be studying the effects of really bad hangovers in space. The moon is really interesting to me because I get that there's probably natural resources and certain things there that we might be able to go after, but there's something super symbolic about the moon. And it goes back to, our Sputnik moment and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like there's a real propaganda push to actually say, hey, we're China and we're going to gang up with another one of the competitors of the United States and we're going to go to the moon together. How about them apples? And then on top of it, we're going to do a space station. Oh, by the way, I know Russia has been hosting the Americans up at their space station and taking them up there because there is no NASA that really works anymore. We're going to do that too with them. And maybe you'll need us one day. It just feels super, super symbolically propagandized. And yes, it probably is going to be a reality. I'm sure they're going to work together to go do this. But it also feels like they're trying to poke a stick at the bear a lot too.
No, I agree. That's what I'm saying. I don't think we should take the bait. We should if they want to go to the moon, let them go to the moon. One of the things when you study the space race is that you learn that the way that we landed on the moon wasn't exactly the way that NASA had originally prepared. They wanted to have this kind of space station. They wanted to build upon almost a spaceport, if you will, where they could send people back and forth to the moon, eventually to Mars. We didn't do that because we had to beat the Russians. And so now we've got ourselves in a spot where getting to the moon is kind of a chore. It's kind of difficult instead of kind of doing the hard work first. So again, I'm not much on the space travel in general, but if we are going to do it, at least do it right and don't race to beat the Chinese and the Russians there. There's plenty of things here that we could be working on. And I think when you look at the US and China, one of the things I pointed out before is we always talk about their currency. You know what we can do? We can just fix our currency. If we fix our currency problem, it exasperates their problem. So if they want to waste money, because they don't have it, if they want to waste money going to the moon, let them go to the moon. Let Russia go to the moon. Let's not waste our dollars on that because we can actually strengthen our currency if we can. So I think it's a waste. I think you're right. I think it's something that we don't want to get our eyes on the prize on the moon race when there's China giving out vaccines in Africa. And oh, by the way, people in Africa will need a lot of aid coming up. So if we're going to focus on something, let's focus on that.
Yeah, I think, and by the way, the currency thing that you bring up there is pretty interesting also, because both of those countries would love to see the US dollar no longer the world reserve currency. There's been lots of talk about them and other nations trying to create their own sort of version of a world reserve currency. Obviously, Russia's big ability to push something through is definitely natural resources, raw materials, and also oil, which is continuing to move upwards. I don't know where it's at right now. Is it $70 a barrel or something like that? But that's only going to embolden Russia in sort of feeling more aggressive than they have been, especially back when oil was, $10 a barrel. So we'll see how it plays out. But two of our not friendly faces out there at that stature and that, sort of aggressiveness, getting together and working together on something like space really poses a threat in various other spaces too.
Do you read Foreign Policy by any chance?
I do.
Okay, so they had a piece today. I don't know if you saw it. It's talking about China's entanglement with the Middle East. And so China is currently doing deals with Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. Now, that list is a list of countries that don't necessarily get along with each other, but they're all doing deals with China. Of course, some of them are OPEC members, so they do deals in OPEC, which is story for a different day. But this idea the U.S. will have to face at some point is that China is going to do deals with our enemies. And so we have to either decide, do we want to make a perpetual enemy out of Iran until they bow to all of our wishes, or do we want to take the China approach and realize that we're going to have to work with more nations? And at some point, you're going to, so I'll stop there and get your thoughts, but I think it's something that U.S. foreign policy really needs to re-examine. So you talk about going to the moon, don't waste your time there. Look at what they're doing here in the Middle East. They're making allies. I use that term very loosely here, not formal allies. They're making partners out of all kind of countries in the Middle East. That could pay dividends for them down the road.
Oh, 100% will. I mean, they need the energy source that's there anyway, number one. But then number two is, Saudi Arabia showed us in the 80s when we shut off arms and wouldn't sell them the intercontinental ballistic missiles that they wanted, that they were willing to go to the Chinese in a heartbeat and get them themselves, even though they knew that those were completely inaccurate missiles and purely something just to put on a show for Israel. But if we fully shut out these countries, China is going to fill that void. Now, as we know, filling that void brings all kinds of other challenges and complications, which I wouldn't mind China being completely mired in. It actually might humble them a little bit, figuring out how difficult navigating the Middle East actually is. But you can see sort of the dilemma that, whether it's the Biden administration or Congress or any of our leaders or diplomats have in regards to trying to figure out what kind of repercussions Saudi Arabia or some of those other countries should have in the event that they break international laws or they pull a Khashoggi or whatever it is. Because if you're too hard on them, suddenly there are others that will fill that void. I'm not defending anything in regards to our response to MBS at all, but I am saying there's a lot of nuance to making a decision on something like that.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so you had a couple other stories. I'll let you pick the next story.
Yeah, I think, the Confucius Institute thing is interesting to me, not because it hasn't been in the news before, but remember, these are the entities that I think there's like 50 of them at various college campuses. They pay a big amount of money to the individual universities or educational institutions in order to have them there. And then the goal is to have classes and different clinics, all kinds of stuff to be able to teach the propaganda that the Chinese Communist Party wants young Americans and young international students to have in regards to how they look at China. It's a little bit like an advertisement for China in some ways, and then it's much more nefarious in a propaganda and sort of messaging ways in others. In looking at this story again, and after my appearance on Max Kaiser's show, where I talked about how China plays a long game, they play a game of chess. We play, a game of checkers on 2 4-year election cycles, quarterly results, share price fluctuations, what have you. It's interesting. These Confucius Institutes are actually a really long game, right? Like you're essentially putting them up at places where young people that aren't in positions of power yet will digest what you want them to learn about your nation, what you want them to learn about your ideology and all that kind of stuff. And then you're planting the seed so that 20 years in the future, when they're actually in a position of power, whether it's in business or in leadership or whatever it is, that they're suddenly going to apply some of this stuff that you put in their brains, 20 years ago. It's such an interesting, almost Dr. Evil, long way of looking at some sort of offensive strategy, but it plays into so many other things too. And I bring up the big data issue with European Union and the fact that they're now reinvestigating TikTok and whether TikTok should be an application that's used there. And I would say TikTok's the exact same thing, right? We're going, oh, it's just a bunch of big data that they're harvesting from 14, 15, 16-year-olds, whatever. Like, there's no harm in that. It's not like, they're hacking, the Pentagon or something like that. But they're actually taking data that maybe they don't even want to use right now. Maybe they're just going to harvest it, keep tabs on the different people that are getting it from, or the groups of people that are getting it from, and then 10 years from now, apply it to whatever AI technology they have, or whatever their algorithms or technology or their espionage capabilities, so that it can be used against us. It's all part of this crazy long game. And it's so hard for me to think about how they think so far in advance and how they plan so far, because it seems way smarter than a human is set up. And I don't want to give them more credit than I should. The only thing is that it is a civilization or society that's been around 5,000 years, and they've always had these super long-term plans. Like, it's just the way their mentalities worked. So I just find it really interesting as you dive deeper in some of these stories into what is exactly happening. And I don't want to put on a tinfoil hat or surmise that like really bad stuff that seems super sophisticated is definitely happening, but you can put it all together and see that there is a potential for it. That's for sure.
Yeah. So I think we've talked about this on the show before. I've got my quotations from Chairman Mao right here, and haven't read it all. I pick it up 2 or 3 times a week and read it. I'm actually putting out a video on LinkedIn talking about why I read it. And one of the things that we've lost in American society is the study of history, but also the study of political thought. And so, I like reading Mao because I can't read Mandarin. So anything I read from China has to be translated. So I understand there's a little bit of a deficit there. But when you talk about a debate in America, what we see today is Chris says something, Ryan says something, and then we stand back and we go, well, Chris thinks this because he loves everyone, and Ryan does this because he hates everyone. And we kind of have removed political philosophy and understanding why people come to the conclusions that they do. And instead we attribute motives to them. And so one of the things that the Chinese to be very good at is understanding not only their history, but the political philosophy that goes along with it. And I think on some level, they try to understand capitalism, probably a very much skewed version of capitalism. But in the U.S., we have to study political philosophy and understand it and think, for instance, there are things that Mao says that I would agree with, right? If he says the sky's blue, I'm going to agree with it. If he says everyone should have access to clean water, I'm going to agree with it. It doesn't mean that we get there the same way, but he's also going to say things that I'm going to disagree with fundamentally. And why does he say those things? And so trying to understand why Mao thinks the way he does helps me better understand why Xi Jinping will say stuff today or why the next leader will. So China does a very good job of getting into the philosophy of politics or life or whatever. And in America, we try to say, you like this, you don't like this, and so we're going to judge you based upon that instead of understanding that there's larger worldviews at play.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes into the art of war and the way Chinese. I mean, look at Xi Jinping and Terry Branstad, the old Iowa, governor. They met back when Xi Jinping was essentially on a Communist Party exchange program, living in this middle of the United States of America, just simply to try to understand how Americans think, understand how they work, how they live, what their thought process is, what their opinions tend to be, what they digest via journalism or whatever it is. It was a really smart mission, and they all do it. They come over here and they don't just go to New York City or San Francisco or LA. They actually go to the middle of the country and try to digest how as many kinds of Americans like go upon their daily existence. And it's a really smart initiative, and there's not a lot of our leaders that go to China to do the same thing. I'd love to see more of that, and quite frankly, I'd like to be over there more, trying to understand them more too. And I'm looking forward to the next trip. I just hope I can get back to the U.S.
Well, I am not going until I get a guarantee of no anal swabs. That's kind of that's my line in the sand. That's my line of demarcation. So I will let you go first, and if you come back clean, then I'll go. But yeah, I do think you're right. And so when you look at long-term planning, it's not necessarily. So the benefit the Chinese have is that they can direct their entire economy to work on something. So if they want to build buildings or build roads or move to solar batteries or whatever, they can direct their entire economy there. And so you see these massive shifts. And so they can do stuff that's quite impressive. However, because everyone's kind of, or not everyone, a lot of people are singularly focused. Well, if you've missed the mark by a little, now you've missed it by a lot. And so on some of these things that you're talking about with their studying, their thought, their philosophy, it does give them advantages on how they think and how they operate, because those are just practical things that everyone should be doing. But it also, on the other side of the spectrum, we look at their economy and some of the empty cities they have. Well, that's also the result of trying to think long term, trying to plan, and then devoting massive amounts of resources to things that you really can't predict. So it kind of goes both sides of the scale there.
Yeah, no, it's true. But I will say that the United States of America is capable of rallying behind a cause and putting everybody into that sort of common initiative to achieve something that's really great. And usually it comes from some sort of threat or challenge to the nation, like World War II, where pretty much everybody put everything on hold. They rationed what they were eating and drinking, and, you know, automobile manufacturers turned into tank manufacturers and all that kind of stuff. Like, we are capable of it too, even though we're part of a democracy and we have individual thought and creative freedoms and all that kind of stuff. We are capable of competing at that same level with a much better kind of society. So what would be great is if we can remember that and go back to that and think about how we got here and built this amazing nation that I feel like is being challenged by a lot of different threats that, quite frankly, if we were at the level of playing that we are capable of, they would be things we would just brush off.
Okay, we have time for one more story. Do you have one more you want to hit, or we want to go ahead and wrap it? Because I have a unifying message if you have nothing to wrap it on.
I'll let you finish with the unifying message, but I think the one thing I was just going to bring up is there's a lot more headlines about Hong Kong and the outrage that, you know, the elections seem to be now fixed so that whoever, you know, supports Beijing, that's going to happen, and the laws are getting changed and all kinds of crackdowns and all that stuff. All these headlines are old news. Like, Hong Kong has moved on. We took our eye off that ball, and it's now China 27 years earlier than it was supposed to be. And it's definitely not China as the democracy we were thinking China was going to be, which ultimately would be what Hong Kong is. It's quite the opposite. So I think we need to really put our attention on what happens next, and that is Taiwan. And whether that happens tomorrow or in 6 years, like one of our lead commanders in the military came out and said the other day, it's probably going to happen. And we just need to be talking to our allies to figure out, well, what are we going to do when that day comes?
Okay. So we will, as Chris said, we need to unite. We need a common call. So here it is, people. Go to the podcast store and give this podcast 5 stars. Share it with your friends. Tell everyone that you know about it. Let us know, what do you think? What do you like? What don't you like? What topics would you like for us to cover? And we'll gladly hear that. We have folks to give us suggestions. We've had listeners reach out we've interacted with. So that's what we're going to unify around today. 5 stars. That's all we accept, nothing less. Leave a review. Share the podcast with your friends. Let us know. We're on Twitter. We're active. We're easy to reach. Let's unify by talking. So there it is, Chris. There's my unifying message of the day.
I think that's a great unified message, because I'm 100% on board with it too. So thank you. I agree.
Yeah, we're 100% unified. No one disagrees with that. Okay, this show can be found in podcast form on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere good podcasts are found. Chris, you can find at The Dragon Feeder, and me at Ryan Ray Sr. That's Ryan Ray SR on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn. We're all over the place. I'm always gun popping. I'm sure Chris is too. Always talking about something. And so we'd love to hear from you. Seriously, if you do take the 2 seconds to leave a rating and review in the podcast store, it helps us out a lot. Would really appreciate it. Chris, any final thoughts before we close out the show and the week, I believe?
No, I got a couple good interviews coming out and publishing, so I'll put them out on my Twitter. And thank you, everyone, once again for tuning in this week. We had 2 great episodes, and we got many more to go. And just keep thinking about unifying with both our friends overseas and the Western alliances and across this nation, because we do have a threat and a challenge facing us from China. We just need to address it to make this world a better place. So have a great weekend.
And if you want some more China coverage, I did an interview with David Feinstein from the Bush China Foundation on Tuesday, I believe. It's at the War Room newsletter. It's free for anyone who wants to go listen. So go check that out. It's also on my Twitter page, and we will be back next week.
Jen.